Hey, what's going on? Welcome to another episode of AngularAir. We are on our new day and new time. So we're streaming on Fridays now at 9 a.m. Pacific time. So we're going to give this a run. So it's our first episode at the new time. Oh, hey, hold on. Got to mute my other thing.
I thought I was the only one who did that.
Usually it's muted. I guess I unmuted it to watch something and now I forgot to do it. So there we go. Got the doppelganger there for a second, but that's all fixed. All right, I'm Justin, your host. I think I was about to announce myself again there, but yeah, today's episode, we have a acronym episode, an acronym stack episode. So I'm familiar with some of these acronyms. We got a new one today. It's looking like it's the, what is it, the PANNG? PANG? I don't know, we'll find out from our guest how to announce it. I'm familiar with the mean stack and the meep stack and the jam stack, but hey, we're going to learn something new today, so looking forward to it. Let's say hi to our panelists, and then we'll meet our guest, and then we'll get into the content. Joining us today, we've got Bonnie. Bonnie, how's it going?
It's great. I'm excited to be here. I always love AngularAir, and on Friday too. And it's earlier for me. This is very good because it used to be 8 p.m. on my time, and now it's 6 p.m. my time. So I'm very happy, and it's on Friday. I don't have to get up early. This is perfect for me. I love it. Friday. Happy Friday, awesome. Everyone.
Awesome. Happy Friday. Happy Friday. And hey, Bonnie, we've got something new following up our AngularAir episodes that we're going to be doing, right?
This was so perfect because I was thinking about this, and then you came and said, hey, I think I want to move the show to a different day. And I was like, wow, this is perfect because what I've been thinking about, and I wanted to do this, we've started doing, so we have Angular Nation, right? I have this website where people talk about Angular, and we've started doing kind of community office hours where we have some of the core contributors for these libraries come in, and we have people, just random people can come and ask them questions. And so I wanted to start doing that like right after AngularAir, and I was thinking about it, but it's so late and I'm tired. And then you said we're going to move it to Friday and move it up, and I was like, perfect. So starting tonight, starting with our guest tonight, right after the show, and every week right after the show, we're going to go straight to Angular Nation and have a session where you guys watching can actually jump in and hang out with us. And it's going to be super fun. So go RSVP, because I don't know, I think we can only fit like 10 people in there. So we're not going to have too many people. So if you're interested and you want to participate, go and click the RSVP and we'll see how it works. I think it'll probably start out small, but I think after a while, once people realize we're there every Friday night, then we might have to have a system. But I think right now, just don't tell anyone. Just come and meet us after the show and we'll hang out. It'll be fun.
Nice. I'm really excited about it. I'm a big sports fan. So to me, it feels like this is the game, and then that's the presser after the game where you get to actually talk to the star. So that'll be pretty cool. Yeah.
He can meet his fans. It'll be great.
Totally. Speaking of which, our guest today is Bram. Bram, how's it going?
Everything's going well. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for coming on. It's great to see you again, and great to have you on here. Do you want to tell our viewers a bit about yourself, introduce yourself? And
yeah, sure. I got some slides prepared, so I might pull them up already. Let me do that, and then can we start right away with the acronym? And let me quickly share my screen. And I think I just call it the PANGG stack, right? But yeah.
Yeah, that sounds good.
So let me take this one, and I hope you can all see this. Now, for the panelists, feel free to interrupt me, or if there's any questions in YouTube live chat, I'm happy to be interrupted. But yeah, today I want to tell you all something about building with the PANGG stack. It's an acronym that I made up basically for this talk. I started like, I have to give it a title. PANGG stands for Prisma, Angular, Nest, NX, and GraphQL. And we'll get to the nitty-gritty of all of this. Well, Angular doesn't need an explanation in this show. Nest and NX probably also don't need it. Now, GraphQL might be familiar to some of them, to some of you, and some of them not. And I think Prisma is the biggest new one for most of it. So let's dive right into it. The second title I have for this talk is the search for developer happiness. And this has to do with how I got to where I am today. I'm trying to keep it short. It's like a 20-year-old story since I started working and doing stuff. I'm old, so... but yeah, a little bit about myself. I'm from the Netherlands. I'm a full stack developer. I'm a mentor and instructor and also an author. I've written a few books on Angular. Please follow me on Twitter if you want to know more. And one of the things I'm currently residing in Colombia, and one of the things we do here is we have Code Your Future Colombia. I'm the founder of this nonprofit foundation, and we help people from underrepresented groups get a career in coding, and we do that by giving a free 6 to 8 month bootcamp or course. And this year is going to be all online. So last year we managed to graduate 9 students. And a big part of them, they're currently working as an engineer. And we try to get more people. So this is last year's group. And then we hope to do like 20 students this year. So the goal is to double the size. We need sponsors, donations, volunteers. So if this is something that's interesting to you, codeyourfuture.io/Colombia is our homepage. And otherwise, if any questions, reach out on Twitter and I'll be happy to chat about this. So without further ado, let's get into the agenda of today's episode, which is like, how can you qualify developer happiness? So we'll take a look at this. I'm going to spend a little bit of time about GraphQL for those of you who don't know it. And then I'm going to show to you all the PANGG stack. And we're going to have some live coding here and some demo. So that should be fun. So developer happiness.
I love GraphQL.
You love it. Well, I love it too.
This is very exciting.
Cool.
Yeah. Me too. Me too.
So developer happiness, it's like a feeling, and it's hard to qualify, but I try to figure out a few things that make me happy as a developer. And this is the list. Whether I can work in a declarative way makes me happy. Type safety makes me happy. Well, I don't have to explain that to Angular folk because we've been spoiled by having type safety like from the get-go with the new Angular 2 and on. The community is what makes me happy, and tooling. And I decided to put this all in a total happiness, and I'm going to give a B score. So you can get, the tools can get 5 Bs if they're awesome. Well, let's see. I've worked with a ton of tools, but one of the first professional encounters in software development for me was the couple Oracle with Java. And we're talking about early 2000s here. I was in the university, and this is what they thought. And it was my first real-life encounter with software development. I've dangled a bit with BASIC in the 80s, and I've did some Turbo Pascal in the 90s, but it never really stuck to me. And I was fascinated, but I was not at all hooked. And like one of the reasons, I'm going to take you to a show a little bit of what it was like. So this was how you were presented with the Oracle database. And you then had to enter like this. So you can see it's logging in here. And you had to write your own tables and queries, define the types. And this was not a fun exercise because if you made a typo, you couldn't cursor up and do it again. You'd have to write the whole query again. And then you could insert stuff into your database and then get it out. And while I was fascinated, there was a lot of magic here going on. And I don't think it's the right kind of magic. I didn't know what was happening. And it felt very, very old and very archaic, but we still use it today. And the programming language of choice at that time was Java, known to probably a lot of us. I'm not going over this, but first time introduction in coding, I wasn't in love, not at all. One of the things I'm still happy about and happy I learned is that both dog and cat extend from animal. So this is like one of the things I got from university. And then one implements the bark method and the other implements meow. And I was like, okay, now I understand how the animal kingdom works. But yeah, all in all, I wasn't really in love. I'm going to go over the B score here, but it's a total happiness of 1. Like type safety, yeah, was a nice thing, but I was not sold. Then about maybe 10 years later, 8 to 10 years later, I came across Cake PHP. And Cake PHP is an MVC framework which is inspired by Rails. As a CLI to define your data structure, so we didn't have to write create table statements. You could just say, this is what I want my data model to look like. next to that, it also generated your models, your views, and your controllers. So with a few command line, with a few commands, you could generate basically a whole application that did your CRUD, create, read, update, and delete. And I think this is more or less the moment when I was like, okay, I could be a web developer. Like I dropped into it. Bear in mind, this was like mid 2000s or end 2000s. We didn't have like full stack, front end, back end. It was just like you develop for the web or you don't. One of the other things that CakePHP showed me was that you can abstract over a database. So it had support for multiple database connections, which for me was a big, huge new insight. And one of the things I fell in love with was convention over configuration. So it's better to stick to a certain convention than to dial all the knobs and whistles to get stuff in place. So CakePHP, it was a little declarative. The type safety wasn't there yet. The community was awesome. The tools were there, but like there's still a lot left over. And this is when I came, I think that's about like 2014, when I came, when I found Loopback. And Loopback is, let's get back here. Loopback is a Node.js based application that sits on top of Express. So it's a Node.js server. It allowed me to define a data structure declaratively, and not only the models, but also validation, relation, properties, etc., all in JSON, which it would then present as a REST API. And it also abstracted over databases. So it had basically all the good stuff that I looked for. It had this great API Explorer, which right now we know this is Swagger, and this would export your whole data structure. And this could then be used to generate an SDK. And this is AngularJS we're talking about, like around 2014 when I got started with this. The loopback Swagger definition would be read. The SDK would be generated, which you could then just consume in Angular.js. So for me, this was a big thing. I didn't have to write all my HTTP executions myself. I could just say this.user.find or user.find, and it will get a list of users for me. So this loopback SDK was set for Angular.js. It generates the SDK based on the definition, and it was an officially supported solution by Loopback. However, it was only for Angular.js, and Angular 2 didn't have any love at that moment. Luckily, at some point, a community member created Loopback SDK for Angular 2 and up. But sadly, this project got discontinued, and I had to find a new love. And we'll get to my love in a second. But let's first give this a B score. Declarative nature was awesome. Type safety was getting there, but this was still JavaScript. It wasn't TypeScript. There was a community which created the SDK, for instance, and the tooling was pretty nice. You could have your code being generated without having to write it yourself. But this gives us a B score of 3. Now, Loopback and Angular were all pretty good. I still love Angular today, but Loopback, well, I needed to find a new one. And there we come into the world of GraphQL. And we can take a quick look at what is GraphQL, and we'll go over some of the details. Again, feel free to interrupt if something's unclear, if I go too fast. But yeah, the way I see GraphQL is that it's a specification, first of all. It's a way to describe how a client and server can communicate. It's developed at Facebook and open sourced in 2015. It's now part of a foundation, and it's a query language for APIs. It's used by a lot of big companies, including GitHub, Twitter, Shopify, well, and a ton more. And a few characteristics of GraphQL are that it's strongly typed language, it's hierarchical, it's introspective, so you can use the definition to generate code, and it's transport agnostic, but above all, for me, it's a contract between your client and server. And let's take a look at the server first. A GraphQL server consists of two things mainly. A schema definition language that defines what is available on this GraphQL server. And you have to implement resolvers to handle this schema so that the server actually knows what to execute. And if we take a look at schema definition here, this should look fairly familiar for most developers that have either worked with TypeScript or like it has something to do. It looks like JSON a bit. So here we have a user object where we can define their fields. Like here we have an integer which is required. Little exclamation mark here gives that away. There are some strings that are required. And then we have some optional fields. We can define this to use, we can use this schema language to define the hierarchy. So the relationship between user and post is that a user has an array of posts and a post can have an author. So we can define in the schema the relationship, and we don't have to define how this is done. So this is something that's handled by the resolver. We can define our queries. So here we have a simple query that takes an input string and returns a string. Here we have a simple, even simpler query that just returns the uptime. We can return an array of users or a single user by ID. Additionally, to queries, we can do mutations, which are used to handle operations in the database that maybe change state, like login or registration are generally defined as a mutation. So here we do a login, which gives us back a user, or we create a post, which gives us back a post. And the last main query type we have is subscription. And this is what a lot of people would probably one-on-one call like, this is WebSockets. Well, yeah, it's very similar. You can subscribe to a stream of content. And so like right here, I didn't add any other highlights. So in here, you can see we can subscribe to new posts or subscribe to post comments. Now, this is for the data definition part. And then to implement this, you need a resolver. And what we can see right here is a little snippet. This is an example of a simple schema. So this is the type definition that I have. The resolver here, this is just a plain JavaScript object that implements the query type and then implements the uptime method and just returns the uptime of the machine. Now, if you run this in a server, so you can, for instance, import GraphQL server from GraphQL Yoga, and you pass it along, then you will have a GraphQL server. And here, this is about like 15 lines of code if you get the comments out. This is a working GraphQL server. This in a file, do an npm install to get GraphQL Yoga there, and this will work. Then looking at the GraphQL client, it basically has two functions. Next to the GraphQL endpoint, and it executes queries. And if we take a look at some of the queries here, then you can see a query is also very similar to JSON, but it's not as picky. You don't need to have everything in double quoted strings, etc. So we can fire off a query hello, and this would, I'm sorry, I'm messing around with the previews. We can fire off a query hello, and this gives us back a JSON structure. Or we can pass in parameters to give back parameterized data. Here an example of how we get an array of data. So we say, give us a query from the user's endpoint or the user's operation, give us the ID of the username, and this will return an array of users. Additionally, we can take parameters here as well. So we can get an individual ID, pass an object which comply to the variables, and we get back the user with this specific ID. And then here we can look into some more complicated stuff. So we can actually ask for a user, their username and ID, but also their posts and the ID, title, and text of all of these posts. So this is where it starts to get like a bit more interesting than your average REST endpoint that just returns JSON. So here we can see we pass in the variables and then we get back the result in like a nested structure. And this can go on and on. So we can get a user with its ID and its username, and from this user get their posts with an ID, a title, and a text. And from the post, get the comments, with the ID of the text and the author and ID and username of the person that wrote the comment. And this can go on and on.
This is my favorite part of GraphQL as a solution, is the ability to decide what parts of the data you want from your given, front end that you're implementing. Because as you can imagine, it happens a lot, right? We have several parts of our application and they hit the same endpoints to get the data. And one portion of that UI may only need like a slice of this, like the username here, right? And the other may need the full entire user information. And, just a straight REST, we're getting that large payload all the time. But with GraphQL, we got this ability to say, let's sculpt the query based on what we need from the UI side when we request that data. It's a great solution.
Totally. I totally agree. I think they generally refer to it like over-querying your data source, where you get just too much info, or at some points under-querying, where, for instance, if you want to do a similar thing like this with classical REST, you would probably need like one query to get the user ID, one to get all its posts, then for each of these posts get their comments and their author. And this can lead, if you're not well prepared for these kind of things, this can lead to a ton of queries you have to fire to your backend. Yeah.
And, it's not just about like the payload size and the reduction of the payload size that comes across the wire. It's also things like that UX that you're implementing, right? If you had to use an entire user object and you wanted to have type safety on your UX side, right? And you only needed the username, but you had this concept of a user object that had 50 fields, then you're traveling and working with an interface that has all those properties, even though that scope of that domain of that UX only needs the username, right? So this helps with that fragility or that friction as well, right? Yeah, a lot of places.
Yeah, totally. Also, one of the things I really like for the mental model is if you look at this query, you can actually, if you squint your eyes, you can see like what kind of page this would be. Like this would be a page, a profile page for a user where you want to display their name, their posts, and their comments with the author. So you can already see through this query, like, hey, this UI is probably some sort of post list with hierarchy. So yeah. And then to circle back, if we talk about developer happiness, it's these kind of things that I really like GraphQL for. It like takes a lot of things away. It creates a generic common layer for you to reason about. So yeah, pretty cool stuff. And we'll look into this in a bit more detail. But the result of this query would be a JSON object with their nested property, very similar to the structure of the actual query. And then let's see if I got more in the demos here. No, that looks like that's it for the queries. Mutations, as mentioned, generally it's what you in REST world would say generally a post request, where you, or a put or patch request, where you make changes to the backend. But it's all a very similar structure. And the last operation here is a subscription, and this is also a very similar structure. Now, as I said earlier, GraphQL is a specification, but we don't code against specifications. Generally, what we need is an implementation. And there's a lot of questions that GraphQL leaves unanswered, and with reason. And a lot of people, when they initially get started, they're kind of frustrated by this, like, how do I do authentication? Well, GraphQL doesn't care. Like, it uses generally HTTP post messages as a transport. So use whatever you were using already, whether that's a cookie or whether that's a header that you're sending along with each request. A few other things we generally need to access, we need to solve in our implementation: our database access, well, authentication, and common business logic. And this is where I got to the PANGG stack. And as said earlier, I got this name for, well, because Bonnie asked me to come up with a name. And but I've been working with this stack for about a year now. And it consists of the following entries: Prisma as a database layer, Angular on the front end, Nest.js as the API, all wrapped up in an NX workspace. And it uses GraphQL and GraphQL code generation to do some magic. Now, as I said earlier, the the few that don't need an introduction in this show here are probably Angular and Nest.js. Most people are familiar with that, so I'll briefly talk through them. Another familiar friend here is NX Workspace, which is a great solution to run your code in a monorepo. I don't have a specific slide for it, but this really makes your life easier if you're building larger apps. Prisma is a new one, so let's look at Prisma, what it is. Prisma allows you to define your data structure using a domain-specific language, and it handles all your database actions for you, and it generates a client library. And this is, here we come back to the code generation that I got to learn and love so much from my loopback time. If you have a lot of boilerplate, it's probably nice if you could generate it, and even more so if you get type safety out of this. Prisma currently supports Postgres, MySQL, and SQLite, with more to come. So definitely check them out. If we look at this in the bigger picture, then we can see that Prisma basically sits between your database and the Prisma client that it generates. And maybe we can take a quick look at the Prisma schema definition here to make this clear. So what I'm sharing here is my Prisma schema file, and this is what declaratively defines my whole database. And if we go over this from the top, we can see that here we define a data source. So here I instructed like, okay, my solution is going to work with Postgres, and it's going to grab the URL from the environment. And when you run, I want you to generate this client. So you can generate, in our case, a JavaScript, actually it's TypeScript, a TypeScript full type-safe client. It also supports generating Rust or Go code, for instance. So Prisma is not linked to JavaScript, but it's probably the most used client they have. And then here, this is the schema that we can define. And this looks very much like GraphQL. It's very similar. It's definitely inspired by. But yeah, this is what allows us to generate the client, which we can then consume. So this is I don't think it comes out really well, but this is the white thing is the Prisma schema, and then both the green things are basically the two items that we don't really care about in our structure.
So do you write that code that you just had and then run it to get your client TypeScript file and then use that from there? So it's like kind of like a two-step process, or?
Yeah. You make changes to the Prisma schema, and then there's a comment, and I can pull it up right here. I call this one Prisma apply. Let's quickly take a look at what it actually does, because it's pretty interesting. Here in package.json, I got a two-step process to run this. One is the Prisma migrate. So Prisma supports migrations. And the second one is the Prisma generate, which will generate the SDK. And if we go in the file tree here and we take a look inside node modules, you will find a .prisma folder. Here you go. And this is what actually gets generated. So one of the things we have here is like everything about the user. If we take a quick peek back at the schema Prisma, and this already gets into demo territory, but that's good. We see we have a few properties on our user, like name, avatar URL, and bio. And on a little bit, we're going to add a location field here. And we're going to see how much type safety and the system can help us do this in the right way. But if we look in the generated thing right now, in the generated client, we have 0 references. I'm searching for locations. There's no reference to location. And this will magically appear once we run the Prisma apply step. So let's keep this open while we look at the next step in the line, which is Nest. So we don't connect our Angular frontend to the database right away. We'd like to have some area where we can do business logic and where we can basically decide which field we want to expose and which we don't. So yeah, it defines our client-facing API. It consumes the generated at Prisma client for data access. We can use TypeScript to define our GraphQL schema, so we don't need to write our GraphQL schema definition language if we don't want. And we can do all of our authentication validation, business logic, etc. So if we look at the puzzle here, then we can see that, yeah, Nest.js communicates to the Prisma client and it will not touch the database straight away. Now, after that, we want to look at GraphQL code generator. So for a lot of people, and let's quickly take a look at the GraphQL playground here, because this is interesting as well. So the GraphQL playground is one of the things that people pretty much are familiar with when they start out with GraphQL, but it's a way to interactively explore your endpoints. And you can see, for instance, here what queries are there, what the shape of the result is like, and you can also define, you can look like at the relationships that are there, etc. And what a lot of people do when they start out with GraphQL, and this is how I started, that is run a query. So let's say get posts, and for each of the posts we want to get the ID of the text. There you go. And then we can say, give me the author with their ID and their username maybe, so I can link to the profile and avatar URL. So what you see right here is the data that gets returned. Now this is all nice, and it really helps me in development that I have type completion here and validation. Like if I use a field that's not available, this tool will tell me. So this is really nice. What a lot of people do though is they take this query and they will use it straight away in their Angular code. So what they will do, for instance, is in their server just call to Apollo client, which they use to connect to the GraphQL backend, and execute this right away. And I think you're not doing it in the right way, honestly. I think you should use this strongly typed schema to generate code for you. So this is what we choose to do in the PANGG stack. And the way this works, let me quickly get the slide from code generation back. We define the queries in the front end. The code generator reads the schema from the Nest.js API, and this will generate an SDK for our front end. So when we look at the big picture, the Nest.js now here is being consumed, and there is an SDK tailor-made for our front-end application that we can use to ask everything in our Nest backend. And well, then Angular on the front end doesn't need to have an introduction on this show, but to use it with GraphQL, you need to install the Apollo GraphQL client, which is an ng-add away, ng-add Apollo Angular. And this can use the classes and types from the SDK we defined. So you briefly mentioned like, hey, there's a user object and it has certain fields. The beauty of this solution is you don't need to worry about building these types. Once you define them in your backend and you define them in the query, they will magically appear in the front end. It's an SDK that you can also use in Ionic or NativeScript. So in this case, we're building a web front end, but if you have a mobile application, you can use the exact same queries and the exact same generated code in your mobile apps. And this is also one of the reasons why it's so important, I think, to work in an NX workspace, because it really promotes these kind of code sharing. And then this is the complete image. So we go from the database, we have the Prisma schema that generates the Prisma client that gets consumed by Nest.js. And we then have a GraphQL code generator step that generates us a full stack SDK for our Angular. And if there's no questions at this point, let's take a look at the demo.
Hey, we do have one question from Fergus about the Prisma part. I'm going to throw this in here real quick. I should be able to show the question. Yeah. So they ask, delete the node modules all the time. Are those Prisma files that get generated in there, is that a problem?
So what happens in practice, it's not going to be a problem. You're most likely going to have a script that generates this thing for you. So it's the two-step process. If you don't change anything in your schema, you don't have to run the migrations. You just run like Prisma generate. So what I generally end up with, for instance, in your post install, run Prisma generate. And then you make sure that each time you run your npm install, your yarn install, that this thing will get generated. However, if you like, you can also generate it outside of Node modules. Node modules is by default, and I'm not going to lie with you, it felt a bit iffy to generate code inside Node modules, but it grew on me, and I kind of like it. It helps with having like a black box that's responsible for doing all the database transactions. But that's a great question. It's definitely something to take into account.
And it's nice to hear that you have the option to do that, or if that had too much friction for you, you could switch to outside Node modules. So that's cool. That's great.
Yeah. And so one other thing that might be interesting to touch on while we're on the subject. So the code that we're looking at right now in this file, this is living inside my Node modules. Now, if we look at this code here, there's this d.ts file, which is the TypeScript typings, which gives us nice auto-completion in our editor. And then if we look at the JS itself, this is where the actual operations are. But you won't see any queries here either. So Prisma doesn't generate like raw queries for you. Instead, what it does, and this is defined right here, it has a client engine. And believe it or not, this client engine is actually not even written in JavaScript. This client engine is written in Rust. And it has all the stability and type safety that Rust has to offer. And it brings it to your JavaScript application, and it works with you. And now at start, I was not convinced that this was the right way. I mean, I don't know any Rust, and what would I do if this would break? Well, luckily it didn't break yet. The team is very knowledgeable and helpful, and they improve these things all the time. One of the things that I really start to like about this is that I don't have to worry. I can't even interrupt this process. So yeah, you have to be happy with the idea that you basically delegate all the responsibility for data access to Prisma. So that's it. Let's take a quick look at the sample application I got here. So it's a social network, not unlike Twitter. It's modeled afterwards, so we can say hello AngularAir, and this will appear right here. There you go, hello AngularAir, and we can have like comments and do comments on our posts. Well, so far so good, but what's the big deal? You could do this in REST as well. I think that's a general giveaway or takeaway. Yes, GraphQL doesn't fix anything that wasn't fixed before. I think it does it in a nice way, and having the type completion and the strongly typed schema and the validation really helps. But yeah, a lot of things you'll see, people are like, you can do this with REST, Swagger, and code generation. You definitely can. You can get a similar experience. But this is the page we're looking at, and then if we look at the profile here, we can see that we have this location placeholder. So let's take a quick look here, and let me open up the place where we do this. So we have a profile detail component, which is the page we're looking at. It's a smart component or container component. It asks a server to get their data, and we'll take a look at this query in a second. But one of the first things I would like to show you all is that this location field here is a location placeholder. Now let's say we just start typing profile dot, and we can see the top level fields here. This is what gets exposed by my API. So I didn't have to write this myself on the front end, but there's no location field. Let's add it here because I think type safety is generally good explained by showing errors, and this is where TypeScript kicks in. So we now see at our front end, there's an unresolved variable location. So let's use the Elvis operator here. And in order to get this location field, the first thing we need to do is actually in our schema that we're using in our front end, we need to ask for this one. And this is what is being consumed by the SDK generator, or the GraphQL code generation. And as you can see, this is also type safe. So we're 2 steps down the way from the front end to the back end, and we still have type safety. Now, the reason that this field is not known is because we never created it. We never exposed it on our Nest.js API. So if we look at the profile.ts, this is the class we use to define our GraphQL type in Nest. We can see we don't have this location string. So we can now add this one here. There's no type safety here because it's a public API that we expose. We might want to expose arbitrary fields. So there's no, like, there's not a real reason to do type safety. And then in order to make this really work, what we have to do is actually go to our Prisma schema. So I'm going to open it right now. And here we're going to uncomment this line. So we're defining the location here. And as we just saw, inside this generated type, there is no location field. We can't search for it. Now we're going to run into our 2 steps. So what I'm first going to do is run the migration. This is just an npm run script. And this will run the migration for us. So Prisma comes with migrations, so you can see after you've been using it, like what kind of changes you made. And this is a convenient way to reapply these changes in production. It will ask me for a name. So let's say location. And then here in the output, you can actually see, let's scroll to it. You can see what it did. So it gives you like very, very much insights, what's actually happening in your database. And there you go. So migration's done, but location still doesn't appear here. So if I'm searching, nope, 0 results. For that, we need to do the second step, which is the Prisma generate step. So I'm executing this command. And this will actually read the schema and generate my .prisma client in Node modules for me. And once this is done, should be any second now, there you go. Right now it tells us like, I generated it in at Prisma client. Well, we know it's actually living in another location, but this is the public API, and it gives you some instructions on how to actually use this thing. Now let's get rid of this window here and open the index.ts, and we should see that we now, I don't even have to search for it. We see that we now do have this location field. So this is one of the things that gets generated out of the box. When you have your schema here, this gets generated for you. And in our sample data set, we can actually run this query. I'll enable this field. So the sample data gets generated. Let's take a look at our dev server. If all goes well, this is going to get restarted. And then with this in place, we should be able to rerun our front-end SDK. So let's restart this for a second, see what happens here, why this is not happy. There you go. And you can see here that the name, the username, the name, and the bio are there, but their location is not there. So the last thing we have to do to make this work is run the SDK. So another npm run script here. But we can run this SDK. This will generate our code for our Angular front end. And if all goes well, our Angular app refreshes and the field comes to life. So this is being generated. Refresh is being triggered because a file has changed. And once it's done compiling, we should see the fields appear here. There you go. And we see the location of Rick. So
and your sample users, that's where you updated the data for Rick, right? So
exactly.
That's how it got into the database, or
yeah, exactly. And while I didn't really show it, I probably should have. This part is actually also strongly typed. So if I try to add a sample data field here, like age, which is not defined, my code base will start nagging. So like, I don't know age, I can't save this to the database. So also your backend is fully type safe.
And so your sample users is what you use to seed your database?
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
Cool.
We can quickly take a look at how this is used. So in order to define my sample users, I just created a const sample users, and I gave it this user create input array. And this is one of the generated pieces of code. I get this straight away from Prisma client. And the way to actually consume this in the backend, we can quickly see as where this is being used. I loop over this with a simple for, and I say this.user.create. And this.user.create is basically my gateway to Prisma, if you will. And we can take a look at this server. So this is my API data access server. I really like to wrap around third-party services, and Prisma is not an exception. And what I do, I basically extend the Prisma client that I have, and this is where I can handle it. That means that at every place where I need it, I can just inject the API data access service and ask Prisma for its data. And last thing in the demo that I want to quickly show, so we can now see, well, this should be type safe. Probably something wrong, but now they're all like unrecognized. But generally, like this should be handled like, okay, I know this location field. And how this actually works, because we went over this a bit quick, but my SDK command, it generates an Angular service, or actually a bunch of Angular services. So we can look at GraphQL.ts here, and we're going to look for the same location field. Well, here you go. What you can see that in our Angular front end, it exports a type profile, and here is where it added this field. And another important thing here that we have is the SDK. So let me Angular SDK. There you go. This is the public interface we're actually using. So what we can do if we want to have access to the data on the backend, we inject Apollo Angular SDK, and we can just use one of these methods here that are being exposed. So let's take a look at this profile detail page. If we go into our service here, we can see that this service calls right into the SDK. And this again is fully type safe. So you get a result back here, and I can have my IntelliSense help me with what is available. So it knows that this.data, it knows that it has a profiles array, and we can do stuff with it. So yeah, this is basically it for the demo. I'm not sure if there's any other things you'd like me to show or tell, for that matter.
I think this demo is beautiful, and I hope that you don't repeat this to anyone. This might be one of my favorite episodes of all time. Please don't tell that to all of our other guests, because if you repeat it, I'll deny it.
I won't. I'll keep it in. I'll keep it between us. Thanks.
For sure. So another thing the second thing that I really love about GraphQL is the ability for you to essentially offload the logic of having to call those multiple endpoints from your actual data server. All that logic is there to group together the data, and so your front end doesn't have to worry about that, right? So I'd imagine like in here, you're making a call to get a user and their posts, and that's real simple on the client front end side. And then that middle layer of GraphQL is the one that may need to broker. Oh, I need to get the user, and then I need to get the post and bring that together to provide that. I really like that because it simplifies our logic that we need on the UX side and allows us to build these different UX layers more rapidly and with less complexity there, and to offload like essentially the business logic of what is that workflow for pulling together the data you need. Like if I want a user with all the profiles and all their history or whatever, there's logic to do that, and we can keep that out of our UX. Just cool.
Totally. Yeah, it's a real clean abstraction, and this is what I really like. Also, an added benefit is you have like this strongly typed interface, and it works two ways. Like one way is I could replace the backend with something else. Let's say I'm going to move all my code to Go, and I want to still keep using my same application. I definitely could, as long as I provided the same structure. Like my front end doesn't care. On the other hand, it's really helpful because if my backend at some point stops providing certain functionality, my front end will start screaming. So it's not an excuse not to use tests, but you might get to some stage where you don't yet need to use you don't need to build tests yet because you have this in place. So it's a really helpful utility that basically starts screaming when you do something wrong. And I think this is something that we really like. So yeah, to wrap it up here, GraphQL works like a contract, and it's developer communication. It allows you to use generated boilerplate code, which avoids a lot of errors and duplication. And this gives you type safety from back to front. This is what gives me, at this moment, maximum developer happiness. And with that, we're going to score it here. It's pretty much there in declarative nature. There are still things we need to do. I'm not even sure if we'll ever get to 5 Bs here. Type safety all the way down. Community is awesome. It's active, and they create amazing tools. There's still a few more things, but this gives me a total B score of 4 Bs. And with that, that's going to be it for this presentation. Thank you very much.
We love the B scores. That's great. Awesome.
You crack me up, Bram.
Cool.
I was laughing. I'm not feeling good, so I kept turning my camera off, but I was sitting over there going, oh yeah, that's cool. That's cool.
Thanks a lot. Really appreciate it.
Awesome.
Yeah.
This is awesome. A lot of good information here for sure.
Thanks.
Well, let's get to some picks, and then we'll wrap it up. Before we do picks, I want to give a big shout out to StreamYard. They graciously provide us with the platform that we use to power all of our AngularAir episodes for the live stream stuff, the ability to have groups of people sharing screens and things like that, and stream that directly. For us, it's to YouTube. They can go to like StreamYard or Twitch, all these other different ones, right? And it's a full browser-based solution, so it's really awesome. And what's cool about it is right now there's so much activity going on, especially in like Twitch, around people starting to stream Angular content. So that's really been ramped up lately. We're seeing a lot more people do it. If you're looking to do that, totally be excited. You should get into it and seriously consider using StreamYard to do that, because you can get up and running today on it. Again, because it's browser-based. You can share your screen, share your code. Super simple. So we love them. And in every episode we have in our description, we've got a link down there. So if you are looking to get into it, follow that link. There's a little bit, I think, of a discount if you do. So StreamYard, we love them. All right, let's do some picks. Bonnie, do you have any picks?
I have 2 picks, but we already talked about them, but I just want to kind of circle back. So the first one was brand new community office hours tonight. Like right now, I shouldn't say tonight because it's morning where you're at, but today, right now, after the show, go to Angular Nation. If you haven't been there before, then I'll just go check and make sure that all of the pending requests have been approved so that you can get in, and then we'll have office hours. And the other pick that I just really thought was very cool, Code Your Future. How cool is that? I put a link in the chat, in the AngularAir chat. I just think that's such amazing inspiration. I mean, I just love it. And I love you even more, Bram, for showing us that. You showed us really cool code, and then it's just inspirational, and we need more people in the world like you. So I think that's really cool, and I think that we should be promoting that. And if there's anything that I can do to help, please let me know, because I think that's heartwarming, and I think that's awesome. It's a very good thing for us to be all spending our energy on and helping other people. We all need to put some love in the world right now.
Totally agree. Thanks a lot, Bunny. Thanks for the shout outs.
Awesome. Love it. All right, Bram, picks? Anything?
Yeah, well, basically, this whole presentation was about my picks. It's like my preferred stack. There's one thing I'd like to mention as well. Like about a month ago, we started to work on an Angular community on Discord. We felt there was some gap, what was used to be Slack, but it's no longer really active. Steve and I started this Angular community Discord, and it's been super popular. Within a month, we have more than 1,000 members already. We're growing rapidly. And yeah, so that's pretty nice. If you like real-time chat and like to discuss things about Angular, go there. We have GDEs, Angular team members, library authors. We host your library chat. So yeah, that's my pick for today. And if you want to see more stuff like this, also follow me on Twitter and on YouTube, because I'll be sharing stuff just like what you see today on there as well. So that'll be it.
How do we get on the Discord? Do we have to just,
Yeah, that's a great question. Discord.gg/Angular. This is the vanity domain. Probably easier way is to search for Angular Discord on Twitter and go to their profile. You click the link and you'll be added there automatically.
nice.
And one nice thing I might give away, I don't have a date yet, but we'll soon have a Q&A with Minko based around this Discord. So if that's interesting, follow us on Twitter, me and the account, and we'll share it there for sure.
Minko's awesome.
He is, totally.
Awesome. Well, hey, thanks a ton for coming on, sharing your time and sharing this content with us. Really, really appreciate you sharing your time for this for sure. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for having me. It was awesome being here.
Awesome. We look forward to having you on again in the future if any other topic you want to share. So
Perfect. Thanks.
All right, that's a wrap. Take it easy. We'll catch everyone next time. See ya.